The room reeked of stale air and neglect. The faint ticking of an old clock was the only sound, slicing through the suffocating silence like a cruel reminder of time slipping away. Dust hung in the light, streaming through cracked blinds, settling on shelves cluttered with tarnished medals and yellowed photographs. In the middle of this forgotten shrine sat John, a man whose body had withered under the weight of years and regrets. His hands trembled as he reached for a small, worn frame. The photo inside showed a younger version of himself, broad-shouldered and grinning, flanked by his unit. They were boys then, barely men, their eyes full of defiance and fire. Now, most of them were buried in foreign soil, their names etched on cold, unvisited memorials. John traced the edge of the frame, his voice barely above a whisper. "You bastards, you got to rest, and me, I'm still here." The silence answered him, heavy and oppressive. Every breath felt like it had to claw its way out of his chest, a cruel battle his body was losing. He turned his gaze to the window, watching life move on without him. Children's laughter echoed faintly from somewhere down the street, a mocking reminder of a world that no longer cared. On the table beside him lay a crumpled newspaper. The headline read, "Heroic Officer Honored for Lifetime of Service." Below it was a picture of Ryan, the soldier John had saved all those years ago. Ryan's uniform was crisp, his medals gleaming under the flash of cameras, a celebrated hero standing tall before the world. John's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You're welcome," he muttered, his voice hoarse with sarcasm and sorrow. The phone sat on the table, its cord coiled like a snake. He had tried calling Ryan the night before, dialing the number he'd memorized long ago. The phone had rung endlessly, each unanswered tone cutting deeper. He didn't leave a message. What could he even say? That he wanted to hear Ryan's voice, to know that saving him had mattered? He shook his head, the bitterness rising like bile. "Damn fool," he spat to himself. "You saved his life, and he doesn't even remember yours." But it wasn't just Ryan. His family had drifted away too, phone calls growing infrequent, then stopping altogether. His daughter had moved across the country, her last words to him a strained, "Take care of yourself, Dad." His grandson barely knew his name. He was alone, forgotten, just another relic of a war the world had left behind. His chest tightened, and for a moment, panic surged. He gripped the edge of the table, his nails digging into the wood as he gasped for air. The sensation passed, leaving him even weaker than before. "Not yet," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Not like this." He forced himself to stand, his joints groaning in protest. With slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the room and opened a drawer. Inside lay a letter he'd started weeks ago, but never finished. The words on the page were raw, etched with the tremor of his hand. "Ryan, I don't regret saving you. I never did. But sometimes, I wonder, do you even remember?" He stared at the unfinished letter, his breath hitching. The pen lay beside it, untouched. His hand hovered over the page, but he couldn't bring himself to write more. What was the point? He folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the drawer like a fragile relic, and closed it with a dull thud. John shuffled back to the chair by the window, sinking into its worn cushions. Outside, the sun was setting, the sky burning with streaks of orange and red. The colors reminded him of another sunset, long ago, on a battlefield far from home. The air had been thick with smoke, the ground littered with bodies. He'd stood there, covered in blood, some his, some not, watching the sun dip below the horizon, wondering if he'd ever see another dawn. Now, as the last light faded from the sky, a cold sense of dread settled over him. He was still fighting, but this battle was different. It was quieter, lonelier, and there would be no victory. In the gathering darkness, John whispered into the emptiness, "Did it matter?" The clock kept ticking. John awoke in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, gasping for air like a drowning man breaking the surface. His heart hammered in his chest, a violent rhythm that felt too fast for his frail body to endure. The room around him was dark and suffocating, but his mind was still somewhere else, back in the desert, surrounded by gunfire and screams. He clutched at his chest, the pain unbearable, but familiar. It wasn't his failing heart that hurt the most. It was the memories. The ghosts never left. They came every night. Tonight it was Matthew's face, wide-eyed, panicked, blood spilling from his mouth as he whispered, "Don't let me die here, John. Please." John squeezed his eyes shut, but the memory wouldn't fade. He could still see Matthew's hands clutching at him, desperate and terrified. He could still feel the boy's blood soaking his uniform, warm and sticky. He'd tried to stop the bleeding, pressing his hands against the gaping wound in Matthew's side, but it hadn't been enough. "You're going to be fine," John had lied. "Just hang on." Matthew had nodded, believing him, trusting him. His lips had moved as if to speak again, but no sound came. His eyes, full of hope just moments before, had gone blank. Empty. John had held him until his body grew cold. He sat up in bed now, gasping as if it were happening all over again. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he fumbled for the glass of water on the nightstand. It slipped from his grasp, shattering on the floor. The sound echoed through the empty house. Shards of glass glittered in the moonlight, scattered like the fragments of his mind. The next morning, John sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the letter he'd written to Ryan. He ran his thumb along the folded edge, the paper worn from his touch. The phone sat nearby, mocking him with its silence. "What are you waiting for?" he muttered to himself. His voice sounded hollow in the empty house. "Pick up the damn phone." His fingers hovered over the keypad, shaking as he dialed the number he'd dialed so many times before. Each ring felt like a punch to his chest. 1 ring, 2, 3. The voicemail clicked on. Ryan's voice, cold and professional, filled the silence. "You've reached Major Ryan Daniels. Leave a message." John stared at the phone, his hand tightening into a fist. His knuckles turned white, his body trembling with frustration and sorrow. He didn't leave a message this time. Instead, he slammed the phone down, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. His chest heaved with emotion, the tears he'd kept buried for years finally breaking free. "I saved your life!" he yelled at the empty room, his voice cracking with rage and pain. "I gave you everything, and you don't even remember me." His words echoed back at him, hollow and unanswered. The house fell silent again, except for the faint ticking of the clock, always ticking, always moving forward while John remained stuck in the past. Later that afternoon, he ventured out into the world, a rare trip to the corner store. His body ached with every step, his knees threatening to give out beneath him. The wind bit at his face, cold and unforgiving. As he walked down the street, he noticed a commotion up ahead. 2 men, young, angry, and desperate, were cornering a woman in an alley. Her cries for help pierced the air, but no one stopped. People walked past, eyes averted, heads down. John's heart quickened. The scene was all too familiar. He didn't hesitate. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice carrying more strength than he thought he had left. "Leave her alone!" The men turned, their eyes narrowing as they sized him up. A frail, aging man with trembling hands. They laughed, amused by his audacity. "Get lost, old man," one of them sneered. But John didn't back down. His hands curled into fists, his body tensed with the muscle memory of a soldier. "I said, leave her alone." For a moment, they hesitated. There was something in his eyes, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by time. But then, cruelty won out. They rushed him. The first blow knocked him to the ground. His head cracked against the pavement, stars exploding behind his eyes. The second blow drove the air from his lungs, and he gasped, clutching his chest. But he didn't stop fighting. Even as the pain overtook him, even as his vision blurred, he reached out, trying to grab the woman, trying to pull her to safety. The woman, she ran. She didn't even look back. John lay there, bleeding on the cold pavement, the taste of copper in his mouth. His body ached in ways he hadn't thought possible. The night sky above blurred, the stars distant and indifferent. He thought of Matthew. He thought of Ryan. He thought of all the faces he'd tried to save and all the ones he'd failed. "I thought it would mean something," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his chest. But no one was there to hear him. The attackers fled, their footsteps fading into the night. The street was quiet again, save for the sound of John's labored breathing. His hand trembled as he reached for the sky, grasping at nothing. His eyes fluttered shut, his mind drifting back to a battlefield long ago. He saw his comrades, Matthew, Ryan, and all the others, standing together in the fading light, their faces young and full of life. They were waiting for him. The last sound he heard was the ticking of the clock, counting down the seconds of a life that would end, like so many others, unnoticed and unremembered. The streetlights flickered as John's body lay motionless on the cold pavement, his breath shallow, his heartbeat a fading echo in his chest. The chill of the night seeped into his bones, and every breath burned like fire. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and sticky, mingling with the rain that began to fall in icy droplets. The world kept moving around him, cars passing by, people walking briskly, heads down, coats pulled tight against the wind. No one stopped. No one noticed the old man lying in the street, broken and bleeding. The young woman he'd tried to save was long gone, her footsteps echoing into the distance. She hadn't looked back. She hadn't said thank you. She hadn't even seen his face. John coughed, blood spilling from his lips, and let out a ragged laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that hung in the air. "Figures," he muttered, his voice cracking with pain. Not even a goddamn thank you. His vision blurred as his mind began to drift. Faces from the past flickered before him. Comrades from long-forgotten battlefields, their voices mingling with the sound of the rain. "Hold the line! We've got wounded! John, don't let me die here!" The voices grew louder, drowning out the sounds of the present. He saw Matthew's face again, wide-eyed and pleading. He saw Ryan, the young soldier he had dragged from death's grasp. He saw their smiles, their fear, their blood. And then he saw himself, young and strong, standing tall in his uniform, believing that his sacrifices would mean something, believing that he was fighting for a better world. But what had he really fought for? The bitter truth gnawed at him as the rain continued to fall. He had fought for a world that had forgotten him, a world that didn't care. Somewhere in the distance, the wail of a siren pierced the night, growing louder as it approached. John tried to lift his head, but his body betrayed him. He was too weak. The streetlights blurred into halos of light, and the stars above seemed to pulse with indifference. He thought of his family, his daughter, his grandson. He hadn't seen them in years. His daughter had left without looking back, and his grandson wouldn't even recognize his voice if he called. What had he given his life for? Who would remember him when he was gone? The ambulance pulled up to the curb, and two paramedics jumped out, their faces grim as they rushed toward him. "Sir, can you hear me?" one of them asked, kneeling beside him. John blinked, his vision fading in and out. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The paramedic's hands pressed against his chest, trying to stop the bleeding. The pressure was unbearable, and John groaned in pain. "Stay with me," the paramedic urged. "We're going to get you out of here." But John knew better. He wasn't getting out of here, not this time. As they worked on him, John's mind drifted again, this time to Ryan. He remembered pulling the young man from the line of fire, the boy's tear-streaked face, his desperate gratitude. "You saved my life!" Those words had meant everything to John. They had given him purpose. They had given him hope. But now, they felt like a cruel joke. Ryan hadn't called. He hadn't visited. He hadn't even bothered to remember the man who had saved him. John coughed again, more blood spilling from his mouth, and he forced out a bitter whisper. "I saved you! For what?" The paramedics didn't hear him. They were too busy shouting to each other, calling for backup, trying to keep him alive. But John didn't want to be saved, not anymore. Suddenly, his mind was back on the battlefield. The air was thick with smoke, the sound of gunfire deafening. He saw Matthew again, dying in his arms. He saw his unit falling one by one, their bodies crumpling into the dirt. And then he saw himself, standing alone in the aftermath, surrounded by death, clutching a blood-soaked letter in his hands. "Tell them we fought," one of his comrades had whispered before dying. "Tell them it mattered." But had it? Back in the present, John's heart began to slow. The paramedic's voice sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from underwater. "We're losing him!" The words echoed in John's mind, but he felt no fear, only emptiness. As his vision faded, he thought of the letter he had written to Ryan, the letter still sitting on his kitchen table, gathering dust. Unsent, unread, forgotten. The paramedics worked frantically, but it was too late. John's body went still, his eyes fixed on the sky. The stars above shimmered coldly, indifferent to his life, his sacrifices, his pain. The clock had stopped ticking. The next day, a brief obituary appeared in the local paper. John T. Collins, veteran of foreign wars, passed away quietly at 78. He is survived by his daughter and grandson. Funeral services will be held on Thursday. No mention of his bravery, no mention of the lives he saved. Just a name and a date, lost among dozens of other notices. At the funeral, only a handful of people showed up, mostly distant acquaintances and curious onlookers. His daughter came, standing stiff and awkward by the grave, her eyes dry. Ryan never came. The letter remained on the table, unopened and unread. The medals were packed away in a dusty box, stored in a dark corner of a forgotten storage unit, and the world moved on. In the empty house, a single photograph sat on the windowsill, a picture of young John standing tall with his unit, smiling despite the horrors they faced. The photograph gathered dust as the sun set, casting long shadows across the room. The ticking of the clock had stopped, and in the silence, the world forgot.